Hi, here's May and welcome to this video, which is the art style challenge. For this video I'm gonna draw my original character Yumi in 6 art styles, and I also kind of designed a new outfit for him for this. I already did some art style challenges drawing Chongyun and Aether from Genshin Impact, and I drew them in 10 art styles. In these videos I used art styles from different shows and anime, but for this video the art styles I'm gonna draw Yumi in are some art styles that I'm just generally inspired me at the moment I drew him. The references I used when drawing this were from the time I drew it, so over time the artist styles that I'm mentioning in this video will also develop and change, so the things I describe in here may not apply to the artist anymore in the future. I just looked at what the artist was currently doing, and for each style I will first break down the lines, how they use lines, their thickness and if they're colored, then the anatomy of the characters, the faces, the hair, the clothes, then also the perspective they use for their drawings and the color palettes. Then finally I will also look at the shading and lighting and some extra effects or what stands out about the art to me. And after mentioning this for the style, I will talk about what I noticed I would want to include or get inspired by for my own art, and at the same time what I don't want to include. And when I mention what I don't want to include, it's not supposed to be a critique of the artist, it's just my own take on that aspect. And all the artists I was inspired by for this are amazing to me and I really look up to them, and that's what I'm going to talk about for each style. And now let's get started with the first art style, which was from Fresh Boba Tea, and she has a lot of followers on Instagram. First, the lines this artist uses are thick and they are often straight or sharp, and sometimes they use a white outline to separate overlaps of different parts of the character. And the outline of the character is black, while the inner lines can be colored. Then for the anatomy, they simplified it a lot and it's also pretty stylized. The faces, the nose is often just a line and the eyes look kind of like these cartoon anime eyes. The hair is simplified as well, and for the clothes, I really like the way this artist draws clothes. They are very simplified with few folds, and often the characters wear very aesthetic outfits and have big sweaters or jackets. Perspective-wise, most of the time the characters are drawn just from a frontal view. And the palettes, I really like the palettes this artist uses. They are distinct for each piece and sometimes monochromatic, but also sometimes including multiple colors and pastels or neon colors. For the shading, the artist uses cel shading and colored shading, and sometimes there's a black shadow under the neck. For the light on the hair, they use some highlights. What also stood out to me about this artist was that they often have for their drawings like water or sparkles, or they also did some art for album covers and so on. And it often has a overall theme, which is very cool. And what I would want to take from the style is that the lines, especially the inner lines, can be colored, and then also details like sparkles or graphic style elements which this artist uses. I also really like the clothing design and cute accessoires they draw, so I want to get inspired by this as well, and the palettes overall too, of course. At the same time, overall too thick for me and the style is too simplified for me. So those are things I don't want to take from this style. And that's it for the first art style. Now let's move on to the second one, which is from an otome game called Aether and Chongyun. The artist for this game is also the artist of a newer game called Cupid Parasite, which I also watched the gameplay of, and the art style is kind of different but also similar. I mean, the characters' proportions and so on look pretty similar. You can tell it's the same artist, but I focused on the Aether and Chongyun style. And for this one, the lines were rather thin, warm, dark brown lines and had different line weights. Especially for the details in the hair or the clothes and the nose, there were very thin lines. For the anatomy, it's pretty realistic compared to the other styles I will draw Yumi in. Then for the faces, they are rather long and have a rounded chin. Then this artist uses different eyes for female or younger characters, which are more round and just tall eyes. And for the other characters, they are more almond shaped and wider eyes and also smaller. Then for the eyes, the artist also often uses many lashes, and the upper lash can even be colored, and underneath the eye they use a darker skin color, which also gives this more realistic look. Above the eye they use 1 or 2 small lines. What also stood out was that the iris often fades into the pupil for the eyes, and the lips are indicated with highlights and shadows underneath, also slightly darker. The artist uses different line weights to draw the mouth. This artist also uses slight shading on the face in general, for example on the nose. So for example, the nose is a bit darker and there's also a highlight on the nose. The nose overall looks pretty long to me, and there is always a small point or an indication of the nostril. Now let's move on to the hair, and this is pretty detailed and has lots of strands compared to the other ones. It's still simplified in the shape and not like in real life, but still it's pretty detailed. And then the shading is not blended cell shading on the hair, and the hair also uses multiple levels of shading and has one overlay layer with some highlight shapes on top. For the folds, this artist uses a combination of sometimes lines but also sometimes just sharp or blended shadows. To me it seems like this artist used only one color to shade the clothes, but through the painterly style this shadow can have a different intensity. It looks kind of watercolory to me overall, and the shading color is pretty muted and not as saturated as, for example, for fresh boba tea. And then for the perspective, since this is mostly art for the Otome game, it's from up front, but then for the CG drawings, yeah, the perspective can also be different. The palettes are muted but rather saturated and overall rather realistic colors. For the shading, it's often blended, but underneath your chin, for example, the shadow is sharp and clearly separates the head from the neck. That's it for the things that I wrote down about the style, and what I would want to take from the style are the rather long faces and the way the chin is very thin. Maybe I also want to add some eyelashes sometimes, or have the eyes be a little more detailed, like in this style. And I also like the eye shape of the characters, that it's rather wide. Then I also like the nose highlight and maybe want to use something similar to it. I also like the hair shading and the detail lines. What I wouldn't want to take from this style is that it's overall too realistic for me, and the nose, for example, is a little too long for me. What I also don't want to take from this style is the painterly shading. I just prefer cel shading a lot. When I drew this, I was struggling with the painted shadows quite a bit, probably also because I'm just not used to it. I just prefer the cel shading and simplified look. That's it for the second style. Now let's move on to the third one, which was from Ensemble Stars. And yeah, I really like this game and all the characters from it. It's a very big inspiration for me. For the lines in this style, they are thin and dark brown lines and sometimes have slight varying line thickness. The anatomy is a little simplified but also rather realistic. Bodies are rather normal but more on the thin side for the characters, and for example on the hand and the collarbone, the artists for this game use lines to indicate the anatomy. For the faces, the thing that's different about the characters is mostly the eye shapes and the size of the eyes. Overall the faces look similar often. For the way the nose is portrayed, they use either a point or 2 or 3 lines, depending also on the angle. There's 1 or 2 lines above the eye to indicate the eyelids, and the iris is pretty round and the pupil very small. For the hair, it's rather detailed and has some strands in it. The clothes have many folds, especially when you look at the cards of the costumes, but it's at the same time also simplified, like this anime style. For some patterns on the clothes, the artists also sometimes don't use any lines and just draw the pattern on it. And the folds are also sometimes indicated through just shading. Not every fold is portrayed by a line. And oftentimes the lines for the foes are either rounded or zigzag-like for the cards and so on. What also stood out to me was that there are lots of flowy clothing. For the perspective, it depends on the card and artwork. Oftentimes it's also a rather dramatic perspective from above or below, but sometimes also just straight from the front. For the palettes, it's realistic but rather saturated colors, especially when you compare to Cafe and Chongyun, which has rather muted but also realistic colors. Shading that they use in this style is a cell shading that sometimes is blended. Also, sometimes when they have a filled area with shadows, it has varying intensity because it's blended there sometimes. What's special about the style is also the way they use shading on the face, because most of the time there's this shadow on half of the face, and sometimes they also use 2 levels of shading, mostly for the hair but also for the clothes sometimes. For the lighting, they often have a yellowish sunlight, or for night scenes a dark blue light. Extra effects, there can be lights on the nose. Sometimes when the character is backlit, there can be a highlight on the face outline. And for the highlights on the hair, they are not just simple shapes, but often a part of the outline of the hair has a highlight in general, and then this fades into the other highlights. And the highlights are portrayed through these zigzag shapes. For many of the artworks, the character also has a slight blush on the face. Now let's move on to the things I would want to take from this style. For one, there's the anatomy. I like that it's rather realistic but also simplified, and just the proportions of the bodies. And I definitely also want to take the noses from this style. I really like the way of drawing noses like this. Most of the time I would use 3 lines or maybe 2. And then I also definitely want to take the face shading from this style. I just really enjoy doing it that way, and I like the way it looks. And in general, I like the way of shading from this style a lot, having a general cell shading, sometimes multiple levels, and also sometimes blending some shadows. And I also like the way the iris is shaded. And what I would do different for my art style is that I would want the face shapes most of the time to be a little longer, and that's it for the third style. And now let's move on to some more Instagram artist styles. And this second one now will also be a pretty popular artist, which is called Miko JPEG on Instagram. And in this artist style, the lines are very thick and have a lot of varied line thickness. The outlines around the characters, or the lines that are closer to the viewer, are a lot thicker, and the face lines but also the inner lines on the hair or clothing details are rather thin, and the lines for this style are just black. For the anatomy, it's heavily stylized and simplified and kind of blocky and uses lots of shapes. Its overall looks kind of cartoony. The faces are rounded and have a round chin, and the jawline can sometimes be rounded but also sometimes more square looking. The eyes aren't too big and have a square or almond shape, and sometimes there's a line or a shadow above the eye, but not all of the time. And for the iris, it's very simplified, and sometimes it only has this one dark black color, but sometimes also an eye color. And for the nose, this artist uses one long line and a point. The mouth is also just very simplified and small, and the eyebrows are rather big and blocky oftentimes. For the hair, it's simplified, but depending on the character, sometimes there are more or less strands in it. And sometimes also this artist uses some highlights on the hair. The clothes are very simplified, but still they use a few folds, which often also have this zigzag-like shape. The perspective for this artist is pretty cool. Oftentimes it's very dynamic, but sometimes also just from straight on. And this artist also sometimes uses a fisheye perspective and lots of foreshortening as well, which is pretty cool since the style is on the one hand so simplified but then also kind of complicated in this way. The colors for this artist are very colorful and they use a very warm palette. For the backgrounds, they also often use just one color, but also sometimes a pattern or a full background, but it's often just blurred. The shading this artist uses is cell shading, but a few times there are also some blended shadows or gradients. On other drawings there also are no shadows at all. The shadow underneath the chin stands out since it's black and generally this artist uses just one level of shading. If this artist uses highlights on hair, what I found very cool was that they just use these small straight lines. And now let's move on to what I would want to take from this style. I like the varied line thickness, but overall it's too stylized and simplified to me, and I would not want my style to be as cartoony or simplified as for this artist, but I think it looks very cool at the same time. And now let's move on to the fifth artist, which is called Sylvex on Instagram. And let's start with talking about the lines. And in this artist style they use thin black outlines, but on the clothes or hair or the facial features the lines are thinner and slightly colored, and sometimes also they use varying line weight. In general, the outlines stand out a lot because of the line thickness this artist uses, and in some of the posts they uploaded, the lines can also look a little more sketchy. For the anatomy, it's a little simplified and rather thin bodies, and the hands are rather thin as well. For the faces, this artist uses a pointy shape and a rather rounded face or jaw. The eyes look like these anime eyes, but they are rather tall eyes. The way the eyes are portrayed is through one upper line, which is thicker and has this eyelash wing, and then one lower thin line. The eyebrows are pretty thin, and the nose has this small line around it to indicate a highlight on it, which looks very cool to me. The patterns on the clothes are drawn onto them without an outline often, and the perspective this artist uses is mostly just from the front, but sometimes for illustrations it can also be slightly from above or below. And what I really like about this artist are also the palettes, and they can appear a bit different, but oftentimes it's pretty colorful and saturated. And the backgrounds this artist uses are also oftentimes just one color with some graphic elements or flowers or something like that. It looks pretty cute to me. And then for the shading, it's in general a blend of cel shading with some more soft shading. There often can be blended shadows or gradients within one cel shaded area, and sometimes the shading is like an aquarelle-like texture. What also stood out to me was the shadow shapes, and that the shading often just looks very soft. For the lights, the artist uses highlights on hair, but not always. What, for example, stood out to me about this drawing of Sogo and Tamaki from Idol 7 was the blurred background and overall the way the blur effect is used to really focus on the character. And then for the illustration of Mitsuki, the colored shadows. And what I want to get inspired by from this artist style would be the thin black outlines, but on the clothes or the hair or facial features there are thinner, slightly colored lines, and also the varying line weight and the rather slim hands. Then I also really like the backgrounds this artist uses and want to be inspired by it, and the way the shadows are often portrayed with these shapes. And maybe I also want to try implementing some colored shadows like on the Mitsuki illustration on some images. What I would want to do differently from this artist would be that the eyes are too tall for me. I would want to draw them wider. It looks very cute in this style, but for myself, when I draw the eyes, I would want them to not be as wide open. And overall, I already said it before, but I would want to just use mostly cel shading. But that's it for this artist. And now let's move on to the last one, which is also an Instagram artist called Hina. Oh, sorry if I spelled this wrong or something like that. I put the name of the artist on the screen, so you can definitely find it and check them out. I'll also put some links to them in the description. Let's talk about this last artist's style. For the lines, we have thin dark brown and very warm lines, with a slightly varying line thickness, and the look of the lines can vary between the pieces. Some have a more sketchy feeling and not as clean lines, while others are cleaner and sometimes even a little painterly or fading lines are used. For the anatomy, it's rather realistic and more on the slim side, and the fingers on the hand look a lot like just cylinders. For the faces, the chin is rounded, and I would just describe it as this anime face, but it's rather long. For the nose, it's a point or a line and has a small shadow on it. The eyes are rather wide and rounded. And for the eye highlight, it goes into the iris. And for the hair, you can really see that it's one bigger shape with some smaller thin strands, and then they either use sharp shadows and a few blended highlights or blended shading for the hair in general, and the artist makes use of 1 to 2 levels of shading. For the clothes, they often look pretty sketchy and have pretty few folds, and sometimes they can also look very painterly. For the perspective, it's different from each piece, but most of the time just from the front. For the colors and the palettes this artist uses, some of them are pretty saturated. Some of the illustrations also don't use any colors and are just line drawings. Sometimes there is a background implemented, but sometimes also just no background. For the shading, this artist uses elements of cel shading, but mostly it's also slightly painterly, and the hair and skin has more sharp shadows, while the clothes have more painterly shadows, and the shading on the skin often has more contrast than the shading on the clothes. For the lighting this artist uses, it's that the hair often has these small shapes, and sometimes there are also some lights on the clothes that are blended. Finally, let's talk about what I would want to get inspired by from this style, which is that the hair has this general shape and a few more detailed lines, and also how this artist uses folds on the clothes and that they use pretty few folds. What I would do differently is also the way of shading. For me, I just wanted to be more of a cel shading style and not as painterly. But that's it for the last artist, and with that I've talked about all the 6 styles. Yeah, I talked about them in a lot of detail, I think. Doing the art style challenge can be very fun, because sometimes when you just draw a lot by yourself, you can get lost in what you draw like. And for me, when I'm questioning what I would want my art to look like, it's helpful to look at what other artists' work you admire at the time and then get inspired by it. You can discover features you want to also use for your art as well and try out new techniques. And even if you don't like something, at least you'll know it after having drawn it and can focus on what you like doing instead. It's very good to just reorient yourself in your art, and also to take a step out of your comfort zone and the way you usually draw. I hope that you could get some inspiration from these artists like I did, and you can comment which of the drawings I did turned out the best to you. I have to say the Aether and Chongyun one was probably the hardest to do and took the longest, while the ones from Miko and Fresh Bubble Tea took me the smallest amount of time. For me, when I'm comparing different artists, I always have to say that for each of the styles there's something that's very cool about it. It's just amazing to see how art can look amazing in so many different ways. I hope this video was entertaining and helpful to you, and have a great day, and goodbye.